All right. Awesome. Thank you very much, Samantha.
Very welcome.
All right. How is everyone? I got a thumbs up. I got 3 thumbs ups and quiet. All right. So let me pull up some forms here, give a couple more minutes for people to jump on. And we are going to go through
That contract.
Mm-hmm.
Good. We got a little connection issue. Let's see what happens here. There we go. All right. So let's jump into this now. The first Wednesday of the month, Tuesday of the month, the schedule is to cover the buyer side of the transaction, which I will do. Basically go through the buyer agency agreement, discuss a couple things that have been coming up on that. Actually probably take us a decent amount of time. But before I do that, are there any pressing issues, questions, or anything that anybody currently on the call has? Perfect. Here to listen and absorb. I love it. Love it, love it, love it. All right, so if you haven't been in one before, and I know some of you have and some of you have not, basically what we do in each one of these is we do the buyer agencies or the buyer side of the transaction the first Tuesday, seller the second, purchase and sale the third, and then kind of a free-for-all on the fourth. Free-for-all normally ends up being some part of the purchase and sale agreement. And we'll give you some exciting news. Well, exciting if you're a contract nerd. I am on the SCR Forms Committee with the state association, and we met for the first time yesterday. And it's very fascinating to see how that process works. And I got to tell you, from having started going back to teaching these weekly in the last 6 months, I really kind of felt that we had a little bit of an upper hand to kind of get a good word in before everybody else. And they are making some serious changes to both the purchase and sale agreement as well as repair procedure, due diligence, and those to make it a lot more clear. So nothing about it now. However, when we discuss it today, we'll be able to talk about, some ways that you can work through it to make it better. So, all right. So what I'm going to do is share my screen. I'm going to dive right into the buyer agency agreement. We'll go through that. And then of course, any questions that you have, let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to walk through the agreement. My goal in these is for me to walk through it with you as you could/should with your potential clients. You don't have to know it. You don't have to explain it line by line, but it's really good to know it line by line. So when you're sharing it with them, they're more comfortable with it. Makes it a lot easier for you to ask for them to sign it. Now, of course, a lot of times we get the question of, do you always have your buyers sign their buyer agency agreement? And the Sunday School's answer is, of course, we do. Now, I also understand that that can be a little bit difficult because buyers don't like necessarily to sign something. However, the question that I would ask you is, would you put a listing on the market without having a listing agreement signed? And the answer to that is probably a resounding no. Legally, you can't. So why do you not treat the buyer agency agreement the same would be my question. I have a little issue with the formatting, so give me 2 seconds to download this and open it back up in a better format. Let's see if this will help. All right, so can you guys read that okay? All right, so buyer agency contract, pretty simple contract. First paragraph basically talks about who the contract is between. Contract is between the buyer, potential buyer client, as well as the brokerage, but you obviously as an agent can sign on behalf of the brokerage. You'll fill all this in. There we go. Fill all this in here. You put the buyer's name as well as the brokerage name, and then you'll sign the rest. Basically, this is stating that they are signing on as you as a buyer's exclusive agent for them, which I should have gone through this. I did not. For that, I apologize. Is something that you would have explained to them when you went through the agency disclosure, right? And the agency disclosure, which we'll tack on to the beginning part of the class because it's good to know that. But the agency disclosure in a nutshell tells them that there are really only 2 ways they can purchase a house as it relates to contract law in South Carolina. One is a customer, one is a client. Technically, they have to initial that they've read that. However, should they not sign anything, it's important to know that they automatically, as it relates to South Carolina law and contract real estate law, as it relates to that, they automatically become a customer and you become a transaction broker for them in that transaction. I know when transaction brokerage first came out, Keller Williams didn't really love it. We have since changed that thought process because it's not always the best answer to go immediately to dual agency, particularly if you don't have a relationship with the client or if the client does not want representation. But the first paragraph in the exclusive right to buy buyer agency contract specifically states that you'll be an exclusive buyer's agent for them, and that you will agree, the buyer agrees to conduct all negotiations for the types of properties described below, which we'll get to, and refer the broker all inquiries made to the buyer about such properties from other brokers, salespersons, sellers, and others during the terms of the contract. Negotiation is defined. It's important to know these because, again, one thing that you should get used to doing is treat your contract as your outline for your script, right? Everything that you need to know will be explained 9 times. Well, I should say not everything. 95% of what you need to know in your scripts can be explained in the contract. So that's why I walk through these, is because the more that you know it, the better you are explaining it to your clients, the more comfortable they feel. Negotiation, as used in this agreement, shall mean property shown, negotiated, and information requested by buyer through the broker. Okay. Next part defines what it is you're going to be doing for this client. Now, the tricky part of buyer's agency, and the reason this part can be pretty important, is this can help you limit your buyer, or can help the buyer limit to what you're involved in if, per se, they are looking in different markets, right? Let's say you have a buyer that's looking and they're trying to decide between Charleston and Hilton Head, and they have an agent in Hilton Head and they have an agent in Charleston. It gets a little tricky because you can't have an exclusive agent with 2 different agents. However, this agency agreement allows you to narrow that down. So if you wanted to do, for instance, in this general location, in that situation, you would put, you could put something as broad as the Charleston Trident multiple listing service. You could put the tri-county areas of Berkeley, Dorchester, and Charleston. You could put something along those lines if you needed to do it. The less information you have in paragraph 2, the more you are covered as an agent. Now, that does not mean put as little information there as possible to try to secure the buyer regardless of what happens. This is all about communicating with the buyer, right? And when you walk through this as part of your buyer agency, you can say things along the line of, hey, Mr. Buyer, generally speaking, what are you looking for? Looking for a single family home in the north area. Okay, great. And what's your price range? You can put that in here. General locations, preferred terms, and other. I don't know that I get too detailed in that, because you also don't want to pigeonhole yourself into something so narrowed that a small slight change in terms can be an quote unquote out for this. So paragraph 3, this is what basically where you disclose what your duties are to the buyer. Now, it's important to know this because this will help set your standard. Again, this isn't a buyer's class. If this is this is an agency class on this. If you haven't been to Lynn's buyer's class, of course I'm biased on it because she's a really, really, really attractive buyer's agent, and I happen to be married to her, so she really knows what she's doing. It is a great buyer's class, and it follows a lot of the letter of the law, which is why it's important to know what the broker's duties are. This helps set up expectations when it comes to working with buyers, and I'll point out a couple of areas to show what I mean by that. So the broker's duties: the broker shall provide buyer meaningful explanation of agency and shall use the broker's professional real estate knowledge and skills to represent the buyer in a diligent and effective manner to locate property which is available for purchase or lease and suitable to the buyer. Now, this is one of many steps. This isn't your only role, but do notice that you're signing a document that says you will provide a meaningful explanation of agency. So if you have not done that, you're already running the risk of being out of integrity by signing this document. So just be careful on that. Part B, if the broker is not representing the seller, the broker shall represent solely the interest of the buyer in all negotiations and transactions regarding the acquisition of real property, and repudiate any agency or subagency relationship with the seller or the company representing the seller, and shall not claim the subagency compensation offered to the selling broker in the multiple listing service. This is kind of a obsolete phrase because honestly, subagency really doesn't exist anymore now that they've put transaction brokerage in here. So this is an example of something that really needs to come off the form. However, what it basically is saying, so you can explain it to your buyers, at this point it's saying, listen, I don't have any sort of relationship with the seller or the seller's agency if they are represented by another agent, right? That's not to say I can't represent you. They can be a transaction broker or anything like that. However, if they do have an exclusive agent listing their property, I do not have any relationship from them with them, and I am not getting any other compensation because of that non-relationship other than what is disclosed by me being your buyer's agent. C, if the broker, meaning you, represents the seller as well as the buyer, i.e. disclose dual agency, the broker shall not disclose the buyer information obtained within the confidentiality and trust of the fiduciary relationship with the seller, nor disclose to the seller's information similarly obtained from the buyer without the consent of the party adversely affected by the disclosure. Basically, this is where you're getting into your description of the buyer with the buyer of what could happen should it be dual agency. Now, let me come back to that. D, the broker may represent other buyers who may be interested in the same properties as the buyer. Upon the termination or completion of this agreement, broker shall keep confidential all information received during the course of this agreement, which was made confidential by written request or instructions from the client, except as provided for under South Carolina law. Last part's a quick disclosure. Broker represents that the broker is duly licensed under the law of South Carolina as a real estate broker. Broker will use their best efforts as buyer's agents to locate property of the type described in Section 2 of this contract to negotiate acceptance of any offer by the buyer to purchase and lease the property or lease the property. During the terms of the contract, broker will give buyer information describing and identifying the properties that appear to broker to substantially meet the conditions set forth in Section 2. All right, so let's talk about this as human beings now. Couple different things that this brings up, and the big one is agency. So obviously the first part is you want to disclose what agency is, which you would have done that through the agency disclosure. You want them to then make a decision as to whether or not they want to be represented as a customer or a client. Assuming they want to be represented as a client, you're moving forward with this document. You'll then explain to them that you are not in scenarios where you are not representing the seller because they are represented by an agent. You are not receiving any additional information or have any relationship outside of this, that you're an exclusive agent for that buyer. And then lastly, disclosing in the event that there is disclosed dual agency, which would mean that the buyer and the seller are represented by the same broker, that will be disclosed. And then here are the conditions regarding confidentiality, yada, 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 which we talked about. So to clarify, in our market right now, you would be in dual agency in a couple of situations. Well, any situation where a client says, I want to be represented as a client by you on both, as a buyer, and I know you represent the seller. So if you have two clients in a situation that's saying, hey, we both want to be represented by you in the same transaction, you now have disclosed dual agency. You would also have disclosed dual agency should you bring an offer. If I were to have a listing, you were to bring an offer on one of my listings, or vice versa. I don't work with buyers, so that would not be the case. Most of the time, you would have what is called designated agency if it is with a Keller Williams agent in Charleston. You could technically argue it's not designated or dual agency because they're different entities when you talk about the, as far as the LLR is concerned, between the four different offices. However, that's not a good idea in my opinion. The more disclosure that it's not a non-arm's length transaction, the better. So for instance, on the call here, we've got Steve that's in the Mount Pleasant office. We've got Jay that's in the West Ashley office. If they represented the buyer and seller on either side of a transaction, that would be designated agency. And that's what will happen most of the time. If you get a sign call and you don't know the buyer from Adam, the buyer says they do not have an agent. You explain agency disclosure to them and they say, you know what, we're fine. We don't need an agent. That is totally fine. You would just simply have them initial that, sign a transaction brokerage agreement that's stating that we represent the transaction as it relates to them. We do not have an agency relationship according to them. Now, should you decide to do that, understand all you can do at that point is fill in the blanks and point them in the right direction. So if they're the buyer, great, we want to make an offer. Awesome. Here's the form. Let me know what you want me to put in each blank. Well, what do you think about the price? I think that the seller is offering the home at $300,000. And if you submit an offer at $300,000, there's a good chance they will accept it. If you're asking if you should go in lower, all I can tell you as the seller's agent that should you go in lower, I will present that offer to the seller and get back to you as to what they want, whether or not they decide to move forward, counter, or whatever it may be. Now, that doesn't mean should they decide to be a client with you that you can say, well, yes, Jay, they're offering 300, but I know in a conversation they'll take 275. Don't have to say that. However, you can go deeper and say, Jay, that's a good question. Let's take a look at the comps and let's see what you feel that you should offer based on my interpretation of the market. What the comps are saying is this house is priced at 300. These last 3 homes sold. One sold at 275, one sold at 285, one sold at 305. Here are where they're similar. Here's where they're different. Which way do you think that you should go with that price? You're now giving them advice. You're giving them guidance on the market, but you're not doing that as relation to what you know the seller should or would take. Make sense? Questions so far? It's fun stuff. So I tell you what, contracts are fun. Contracts and finances, everyone's favorite. And I got a couple grins on that. Not many though. All right. Don't give up on me, guys. So let's jump back on. Paragraph 4.
I have one
Yes.
question.
Okay.
Trying to think of where I saw it. Something about best effort for section 2. What does best effort mean?
So it's in section 3, and it basically says the best effort to find the property that was described in section 2.
Right. The only reason I asked that question is just because I know now there's just, so few listings, and like, what does best effort mean? Is it go to the MLS and, like, is there, am I reading into this too much? I think sometimes can be really analytical, as you probably know.
No, you're not at all. Actually, I appreciate that you recognize this, because one of the things that this does point out is that really can't be your only value, especially right now. Your only value can't be the MLS. I mean, 9 times out of 10, they're already getting it from a website anyway. And gone are the days where we can say, well, I get things faster than anyone else. No, everything updates within 24 hours at the latest. Now, the accuracy of the information is a different debate. That becomes, quite honestly, Lauren, that becomes part of your value proposition, right? The best efforts in working with Lauren is that I comb the MLS and I do this, I do that. The best efforts of working with Jay means that I do that. And then in addition to that, should you want a home in the neighborhood where there aren't any current listings, I will go out and I'll send letters out to the neighborhood, or I'll door knock the neighborhood, or I'll do this. Or, in some of your buyer presentations, some of the things you can add is we reach out to any any past clients that we have in our database that may be interested in selling now that would fit your criteria. So that really does become into your value proposition. There's not a real good definition of best efforts as it relates to your legal obligation.
Okay. Thank you.
But be mindful of it, and I'm glad that you are, that other people are, this is a really good discussion. I appreciate bringing that, because other people really are selling better efforts than just going on the MLS, right? And you can have a fantastic customer service thing, and that can be part of your efforts. But if you're also not keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak, on what you're doing or what you're offering to do or saying what you're going to do in a good script, you just need to be careful that you may be outscripted by another agent that simply said, you know what, I'll let my database know just in case any of my past buyers want to sell. Right. So as part of your buyer presentation, I'd think of any different way that you can go out and find sellers in this market right now. And by the way, I do firmly believe that everyone should state in this market. Here's the deal. I know MLS, the internet, is number one. I'll show you the stats. 7% of the buyers found the house they were looking for on the internet. That is going to be different this year, because we have so few homes that are available based on how quickly they're selling. So one of the things that I will do, Lauren, is if you're looking for a home in Brickyard and there's not one in there, I'll door knock the homes in Brickyard you want me to see, just, or I'll send them a note, or I'll do this. You should do that for a good service to your client. What's another reason you should do that?
So the door knocking is something that, I could have my exposure and having other listings and.
Correct. Exactly. 100%. That you may find someone who's interested in selling and may not be a match for your current buyer, but then it's someone you can turn into a listing lead.
Yeah. I think it has like kind of both sides of the coin, that like I, as a new agent, don't necessarily have the network that a more established agent does, but I have more time, so I can door knock more and that kind of thing. So that's why I think I just kind of wanted to get a handle on what that best effort means. And it, like you said, is dependent upon each agent and what that value proposition is for that each agent. So
100%. One of the things that I'll point out, and again, you may not say it this way, but I'm always looking for good ways to make sure we work on our scripts. So your script in that is not, hey, as a new agent, I have more time. Your script in that is, hey, one of the things that I will do for you is I spend a lot of time with my current buyer clients. And if you do need a home in a neighborhood where there's not one available, I will go after it. I will go through that neighborhood and I will door knock specific homes, whatever you're willing to do, right? By the way, I'm saying to say something that you actually do. I don't want anybody to misunderstand this, but it's not, I just always say, I'd be careful on limiting yourself. Now, if someone comes back and says, well, Lauren, I know that you're fairly new in the business. Is there some concern? Then absolutely, I'd say, you know what? The good news about that is because I'm, fairly new, I'm working with you and 2 other buyers right now. I'm focusing all my efforts on you. But don't give that information first.
Yeah, I like that script.
Awesome. All right.
Joseph,
Yes, sir.
besides, when you're saying other things besides the MLS, and then you mentioned, excuse me, door knocking in an area, what are some of the other options you can do?
Well, door knocking is going to be a big one. Your database could be a big one. It could be geographic farming. We won't get too much into that because I want to stay on track for this one as far as lead generation stuff is concerned. But that is something that we need to be putting out there right now, is more classes on that lead generation. But those are going to be your big ones, is your network going out to people that you know. And then if you don't have a big number there, then I would start going into areas where your buyer's looking. And that could be done in a variety of different mediums. You can go in and you can either do, you could do a Facebook ad saying, hey, I know I've got a buyer for this area, or you could go to specific Facebook pages and say this, or door knock. Personal notes. Personal notes are a big one right now. Form letters are getting a little, they're getting a little bit staticky right now. And what I mean by that is a lot of people are doing them. So you gotta, if you are going to do a form letter, you might want to change it up a little bit and actually put, I just heard of an agent yesterday that ratified a contract in a multiple offer situation. And not only did they have the buyer write a letter, they actually had a picture of the couple that was purchasing the home as part of the letter, and said, hey, we just want to introduce ourselves. We're the Smiths, or whatever their name was. And, we know we have a lot of people looking at your home. We just want to let you know that this will be a first home for ours. We're looking forward to starting a family. Here's a little bit about us, that sort of thing. Put those sorts of things if you're sending out to a neighborhood. Or you don't put it, the buyer can put it. So the buyer can say things about themselves, and you can relay that information that you can't say about the buyers.
Okay.
All right, let's jump back in. Now, the buyer's duties to the agent. Now, this is a good one because you can use this as a script. So we just want to explain this to you, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, so we're on the same page. First is that you'll work exclusively with me as the affiliated license during the terms of this agreement, right? So that means viewing any property, previewing only with me, or if I can't make it, obviously someone that we'd work with. Allowing us to identify the property, negotiate for you, and otherwise represent you, and then refer to me any inquiries received from any other real estate broker or affiliated license. And then this fun part is always hold me harmless, though, for any liability as any incomplete or inaccurate information provided to the broker by the buyer or the seller. Now, what that means is, so you don't automatically go from here are all the things that you're going to do for me and then not hold me liable. I think this transition is terrible. You would just simply say, so what that means for you, Lauren, is there may be times where I get information that's inaccurate from the seller. And this is just a legal document that says you won't hold me harmless. You'll hold me harmless on this. But what I want you to know is part of our process when we go from contract to close is to verify all the information that we have. And then obviously that goes on, that relates to section 5, which is part of the seller's disclosure, whether or not they fill it out inaccurately. And then obviously any claims or anything that comes up for that, we're going to try to limit any bad information and then verify the information we do have. The next part would be assist me or the license in identifying and negotiating the contract to purchase lease by providing me with reliable information. So when we do go put in an offer on this, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, want to make sure that we have current and accurate financial information and that we can give written authorization or get verification of funds from the lender with your permission. This could be more than just a loan, a letter from a loan officer. So I just want to make sure we're on the same page. The second part is just make yourself available to meet with me to see the properties in order that we'll be able to perform the promises of this engagement. So if there are properties that we need to go see on a quick, on a pretty quick basis, particularly in this market, you just might need to be a little flexible on your time. I know that's not super convenient for you, but we are in a competitive market right now. And then obviously what you've already done, this part would be to give the general nature, location, and requirements of what you're looking for, including the price range and other terms or conditions that relate to your property. Again, you'll get a lot of that through your buyer's agency, or excuse me, your buyer consultation. And then once we go under contract, you'll authorize the attorney and the settlement agent to furnish the broker copies of the final settlement statement for the transaction prior to the closing date. So we can review it to make sure it's accurate as well. We just want to make sure that that can be disclosed. You'd think that people wouldn't have a problem with that. You'd be surprised at how many people randomly do. All right, before we go into compensation, any questions about page 1 of the buyer agency agreement? Or buyers in general? All right. Guess that means we're crushing it. All right, so section 5 is where we talk about the compensation of the buyer's agent. This is a fun one because we're having some big, I don't want to say changes in this, but a lot of stuff going on with this. All right, so the first part is the bold part that talks about the fees will be deemed earned when the buyer is under contract to purchase any property presented to the broker or negotiated by the buyer. This fee will be due and payable at closing or upon buyer's default. If buyer defaults, the total commission that would have been due the broker will be due and payable immediately in cash from the buyer. Now, this is something to refer to maybe in the future, but also be careful on how much you stay on this paragraph because you're also getting into legal advice. But technically what this says, as well as the listing agents, the listing agreement, is that the contract is earned when a ready, willing, and able buyer is under contract. And if either party defaults on the contract, both this buyer agency agreement as well as the listing agreement, have a paragraph, which we just read, that states that that client could be liable for the commission. Now, I don't think anybody's going to start their first meeting with a buyer to say, hey, by the way, if you back out on a contract, you owe me money. I don't really think that's a good warm and fuzzy to give your buyers. It's probably not in Lynn's buyer presentation class. That being said, it may be a paragraph that you would want to refer to should the buyer start questioning if they want to get out of the contract. Now, this is also only if you're going to pursue it. If a buyer's in a bad contract and they're saying, I want to default because I feel that the seller lied to me or whatever it may be, I don't know that I'm going to be waving the flag that says, well, if you do, I'm going to demand my money, because they still will have to buy a house. So you want to keep that relationship with them, but it is part of contract law. So you just need to be aware of it. Now, let's go into how it is paid. In consideration of the services performed by the broker under the terms of this contract, buyer agrees to pay the brokers the following fees. All right, there is a brokerage fee option. There are 2 fees and then 2 sub ways that fee is paid. Option 1, or let's start with option 2. Option 2 is the one that is most used by agents in this market. Option 2 basically says the broker shall obtain payment of the brokerage fee out of the transaction. Broker shall be paid by the cooperating broker as stated in the multiple listing service, or as agreed to by the broker and cooperating broker, or as agreed to by the broker and the seller in a for sale by owner transaction. Buyer shall not be responsible for paying broker the brokerage fee. So in a nutshell, option 2 basically states you're getting paid as an agent whatever the seller or the agent agreed to pay you. So if it's in the MLS, you've got whatever's in the MLS. If it's for sale by owner, you better work it out with the for sale by owner before you go under contract. That would be done with a compensation agreement. Okay. Easy peasy on that one. Any questions on option 2? All right. Option 1 is the one we're starting to see more people use, and it's really causing some headaches right now because people don't understand it. Option 1 basically says that the buyer shall pay the broker a brokerage fee which is greater of X dollars or X% of the purchase price of any potential purchase or lease property, including for sale by owners. If within blank days after the expiration of this contract, the buyer purchases or leases any property which broker has negotiated during the term of this contract, buyer will pay for broker the brokerage fee stated above. Broker shall use his best efforts to obtain the payment of the brokerage fee out of the transaction. But buyer shall have, very important, but buyer shall have the obligation to pay broker the brokerage fee set forth in this contract. If broker cannot obtain payment of such fee out of the transaction, any fees paid by the seller or seller's agent shall be credited against the brokerage fee. So let's use round numbers that people normally use in this market right now and say that you checked off, you had them initial option 1. This is the way you chose to do your business. And you put 3% in this line right here under option 1. Here's what this means. Any house that you go to that they are not going to be paying you 3%, you can get the extra money from the buyer. 2 ways to look at this. Some people will say, I'm not going to obligate my buyer to that. I'm going to take whatever I can get. Nothing wrong with that. I have zero judgment. Let me be very clear. I have zero judgment on what way you decide to do this as long as you do it correctly. What people are doing now, though, is because more and more agents and clients are offering, or sellers are offering out less than what we consider to be fair, which was, in this market, 3%. We can talk openly about this because you're all under the same broker. What's happening, though, is if you have option 2 covered or checked off, let's pull it back up. If you have option 2 checked off, so let's say I have option 2 checked off, and I go and I show Gene's listing, and Gene's only offering out 2.5%. I can then call Gene and tell Gene, hey, I notice you're offering out 2.5%. I have an agency agreement where the buyer will have to cover the difference if up to 3. Are you or your seller willing to pay the 3%? The reason I'm asking is if they go and purchase this property, it may cost them a little more than it would be if they purchased a property that was offering 3%. Now, let me be very clear. You absolutely are within your right under the Code of Ethics to call and ask that question in that way. Are you willing to pay 3%? I just want to let you know, I need to disclose to you that my buyers have agreed to pay me 3%. So if they're looking at 2 identical properties, this is not a script to the agent, I'm just showing you. If they're looking at 2 identical properties, this one's offering 2.5%, this one's offering 3%, this one's going to cost the buyer more money because they're going to have to come up with the extra 0.5%. Should you decide to pursue it, that's totally up to you whether or not you tried to pursue it. You can call them, you can call the listing agent, you can ask this. They don't respond well if they don't know what they're doing. If you are a listing agent and you get this call and you don't respond well, it's because you don't understand how this works, so be careful. There's nothing wrong with a buyer's agent calling you and asking you if you will pay more. There's no obligation for you to pay more, but there's no problem with them asking you that. The problem lies is if your question comes across on whether or not you will show the property based on the commission. And let me be very clear. As a Keller Williams agent, you will never dictate whether or not you show a property based on what they're offering in commission. It's not acceptable. It's against the Code of Ethics. And it's quite frankly, I think it's also a license law violation. But you can always ask if the seller or the agent will pay more. I'll be honest, from a strategic standpoint, this works, particularly with some companies and or teams that are known to offer out less than 3%. A lot of times, if you present this to say, I have a buyer that's willing to pay the difference, however, it may cost them more if they go with your house, will you be willing to pay 3% instead of 2.5%? If you ask correctly, you'd be surprised on the results that you would get. Questions about that? This one normally stirs some stuff up, so I want to make sure we get very clear on this one before we move on. All right. Again, it's all about how you present it. I get emails all the time from our agents as well as other agents. We don't have a lot of our buyers agents that do that. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I mean, there's, it's up to you on whether or not you want to run your business that way. I do know some agents that do it so they can have that script with a listing agent. But should the listing agent or the seller decide not to change it, they don't hold the buyer to the extra 0.5%. But they do want to use it as leverage when they try to negotiate the commission. Okay. All right. Next part on compensation, and then we will move on. The next way that compensation is paid, which is not a way that is used very often, is that the broker shall obtain payment of a brokerage fee out of the transaction. It be paid by the cooperating, or excuse me, that was option 2. Sorry, B, the buyer will pay the broker the following, which is either a retainer fee of blank due and payable upon signing this contract. So that would be made out to Keller Williams just as if they were paying you commission, or a service fee that would be paid blank calendar days on whether or not the buyer purchases the property. The service fee shall be the only fee due to the broker from buyer under the terms of the contract. The service fee shall be credited against the brokerage fee described above. So if they are paying, they're paying a service fee here, it could be credited against it. So if you make it above, you could reduce that fee. Or shall be credited against the brokerage fee described above and shall be kept by broker whether or not a brokerage fee is earned, unless the buyer enters into a purchase and sale agreement. In the event the buyer enters into a purchase and sale agreement, buyer and broker agree that the above service fee will be credited against the brokerage fee in section A above. So basically in the last 30 seconds, you can understand why a lot of people don't use the service fee. They would use a retainer fee. Basically, the retainer fees are going to pay you up front. A service fee, in my opinion, is something that would be closed. Some people do it. They pay it in addition to whatever the buyer's agent is making at closing. Okay, so a lot of people will have a service fee that will pay for their TC, whatever it may be, transaction coordinator, whatever it may be. All right, before I move on, any questions regarding compensation? All right, so one last thing to be crystal clear before we move on. In no situation on this planet, as a Keller Williams agent, should the determination of whether or not you show a property be determined on how much you make. Okay, just make sure I have that on this recorded call and everything, whether it be a for sale by owner that has simply said, I am not going to pay you, or a listing that's just offering out what you think is not enough percentages. Compensation and cooperation and representation are two completely different things. So if all of a sudden your buyer gets interested in a home where the seller says, hey, I'm not going to pay you, you still have an obligation to represent them unless you cancel your agency agreement, which at that point is fine, right? You can do that, but you just have to make sure that you can't steer them away from the property because of that. And as someone who has had a couple of occasions where we've had to walk away from a for sale by owner situation, or a situation where the seller got involved and the buyers and sellers started talking, and next thing you know, everyone agrees that the agent shouldn't make any money. I will tell you in no uncertain terms, it absolutely sucks. However, don't worry about it so much that you operate out of fear. You trust me, the ones that you still move forward to represent your client on the strongest behalf, regardless of what you think you're getting paid, will come back to pay you tenfold in the long run. Now, a lot of this is prevented if you have these conversations ahead of time. If you explain this document, again, not in this much detail, you shouldn't be on page 2, 40 minutes into your explanation. However, if you do explain how it all works, then there's not a surprise that said, oh, we saw a FSBO and we went and toured it and talked to them for 3 hours and they agreed that they're going to sell us, they'll give us a discount because if we don't have to pay an agent. So thanks for your time. That can all be avoided, right? If you've done a good buyer's agency agreement or buyer's consultation. Okay, not all the time. There's no 100% guarantee, but you can get a pretty high one. All right, jumping back in. Terms of the agency, pretty simple. These are the terms of the agency. Broker's authority to act in this starts on today and ends on blank time. People always ask me what a realistic time frame is. I don't really think there is a realistic one. What I do on what we started doing early on all of our agency agreements is we have them expire on the last day of June and the last day of December. That way I don't have to worry each month whether or not one of my agency or my listing agreements is terminating. I just know they only terminate on the end of June and they only terminate at the end of December. That's just a practice we put in place because I was tired of getting calls on, the first, because I'd forgotten that a listing expired or hadn't realized that a buyer's agency agreement had expired. Paragraph 7 talks about the consent. Mrs. Buyer, this is where you'll consent to dual agency or designated agency as we've already described. You shouldn't have to describe it again here. First part of this paragraph says that I've received the explanation of the types of agency relationships that are offered by the brokerage in South Carolina. Now, if you have not shown them that at this point in time, it's a little awkward because this is saying that you should have. So it's super important to make sure you do. Then you have a choice that whether or not you will give me permission to act as a dual agent, or you will not give me permission. And then you will also give permission to act as a designated agent, or not give me permission to act as a designated agent. I do not recommend that you do not give permission. So if that is a question that you have about it, let's talk through that a little bit more to see what your concern is. So a lot of people just don't understand it. Dual agency, I can get it because it's you, right? Designated agency, like I said, I mean, Lauren and Jay, I don't think know each other. So if Lauren and Jay went into a designated agency agreement together, it's kind of hard to say that there's a huge conflict there. There's only a potential exposure should there be a conflict with the transaction. All right. It's a different story though if Lauren's on my team. Lauren's on my team, she represents a buyer that puts in an offer on my team's listing. That's dual agency, right? That you can't say, or husband-wife teams. I can't say, or significant others, couple teams. You can't say that you're not going to have some sort of non-arm's length relationship there. Okay. All right. Page 3. Oh, all the fun disclosure pages. Go through these a little faster because a little bit of a repeat. Paragraph 8 says, by the way, especially in this market, Mr. Buyer, just want you to understand that I do have other potential buyers that have entered agency contracts with me in this market, and that they know that that they may be looking at the same houses that you are. Now, if you currently don't have buyers that are working in the same market right now, you can say that. You can just simply say, in the event I get one, I just, there's a possibility for it here. Paragraph 9, indemnification of the broker. Buyer promises to disclose to broker whether buyer has signed any agency agreement with any other broker or has been given prior information about any property that is subject to this contract. Here's the deal on this one. It's also saying that in the event something happens that, you won't hold that. If they fail to tell you this, and then you incur any loss or damage as a result, any claim can be kind of go back to the buyer. Right. So basically, Mr. Buyer, if you don't tell me that you're working with someone else, we ratify a contract, close it, and then all of a sudden I get an arbitration hearing says that I owe you the money or them the money, you're going to pay for this. There's a different way to explain this. And that's, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, are you working with any other agents before I get you to sign this? Have you signed this agreement with any other agents? Well, no. Okay. Have you looked at any properties or put in any offers? Well, yeah, we put in an offer with this one agent, but it didn't work out. So, but we didn't sign anything. That's a red flag, because what more than likely happened 90% of the time is the buyer's agency agreement was the first 4 of the 11 pages that they send them to sign, but they didn't realize what they were signing. Sucks, yes. However, they could be under an agency relationship at that point, and there's nothing wrong to pick up the phone, call them and say, hey, Jay, got good news and got bad news. Good news is I found out that you worked with the Smiths. Bad news is they don't want to work with you anymore. And I wanted to clarify, they said they're no longer in an agency agreement with you. Is that the case? Yes, it is. No, it's not. Okay, great. Sorry. Let me know if I can do anything. If they don't know, or they do know they're under contract, then you need to say to them, unfortunately, I can't represent you until you've terminated that agreement. And I don't know what that agreement states as far as terms are concerned. So you'll have to talk to that agent about whether or not they still have an agreement with you. And you've got to push it back to them. You can't go to them and say, typically I let people out of my agreement whenever they ask, or typically I only do a 3-month agreement, anything like that. You got to keep that all out of your vocabulary. You just have to point them back in that direction. Now, what's happening a lot is typically what's happened is the buyer and the agent got sideways or something happened and the agent's not responding to them. 9 times out of 10, the agent does not care anymore if they're not working with the buyer, because something happened. We just had one. That exact example I just gave you happened in the West Ashley office last week. We had a buyer call in, sign call on a listing. Agent showed them their listing. They said, well, we want to put in an offer. I said, okay, great. Have you, want to make sure you're not working with any agents, anything like that? Well, no, not anymore. I put in an offer and we're still, battling my earnest money, but I never signed anything with them. So I picked up the phone. We asked them to go back to their agent, and they said, we've tried a couple times and have not heard from them. Picked up the phone. I'll say this because it's a great story. It was with a Jeff Cook agent, and I called Jeff Cook Real Estate's broker, who's fantastic. Her name's Chris McDonough. And I talked to Chris and wrote her through everything. And she's like, Joseph, know exactly what you're talking about. You are welcome to work with that buyer. They did not end things well. Yes, they're still battering their earnest money. I'm not saying that she's not a qualified buyer or anything like that, but yes, we're no longer in a relationship with them. So appreciate the call. But just so you know, they still haven't worked out the earnest money, but we're not holding it. We're out. It was a fantastic it was the best conversation I've had with a broker in like 3 weeks. And it's about us taking one of their clients, for lack of a better way to put it. Right. So again, just communication is key in all of this and when you handle it. All right. Disclosure of buyer's identity and confidentiality. Sometimes your buyers will want to be confidential. I have not seen one. I've only actually seen one since I've been a broker. 2, where the buyer wanted to be kept confidential in this. So this is where they would disclose whether or not they want to do so. Broker liability limitation. This is the one that basically says, I'm a buyer's broker. My assistance and value in bringing about this contract. In consideration and recognition of the risk, rewards, compensation, and benefits arising from this transaction, your broker by agrees that he shall pay a broker's attorney fees, and that the broker shall not be liable to the buyer in the amount exceeding the broker's compensation. So if something goes wrong in this, is basically what this whole paragraph says. If something goes wrong in this transaction and you feel that it's my fault, You cannot hold me liable for anything more than what my compensation was going to be. Okay. Now, let's just go ahead and put the moose on the table. None of this matters when people start suing. They're going to sue for however much they want. We can refer to this all day long. And quite honestly, if you ever get a broker that or a buyer that doesn't want to sign this, or they want to scratch that paragraph, I'm totally fine with it. I've spoken to our attorneys numerous times. They've said, honestly, it doesn't really hold water. If they want to sue you, they're going to sue you. So again, it's just basically says Mr. and Mrs. Buyer should Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, should something come up in the transaction and you feel that we were at fault for it, this is just limiting how much we could be liable for financially. Paragraph 12 says you will not discriminate. Basically, I can't discriminate where you want to live based on the protected classes. Paragraph 13 says that you need to have professional counsel on anything outside of finding a property, basic information on the property and the contract. You will be working with an attorney. You should consult a tax advisor on all tax information. Your lender is going to talk about your finances. Your appraiser is going to talk about what the value is worth. Obviously, they're probably not going to talk to us though. Surveyors, engineers, home inspectors, and other professional services. So you're agreeing to seek professional advice concerning the condition of the property, legal, tax, and other professional matters. Now, here's how this script goes. The reason this is in here, and the reason that I stress this, Lauren, is not that I don't want to take any responsibility. I'm actually here for all of this. However, we are going to be dealing with a lot of people from contract to close. So I just want to emphasize the importance of those people that we work with on our team. So when we do have your lender working with us, they are going to be the ones that's going to be the absolute expert when it comes to the finances. And then once we go under contract and you get your home inspected, I recommend these two home inspectors, this home inspector. You're welcome to choose whomever you would like. Regardless, that is going to be the expert as it relates to the structural integrity of the home. And then when we have the CO 100 done, I recommend this company. You're welcome to use whoever you are. They're going to be the expert as it relates to the CO 100. The reason that you should do this is twofold. One, it legally says that you should do this. And two, too often we try to be the voice of everyone to the voice of everyone. And that's where we get in trouble. So I'm working with Jay and he's my client, and I've got Lucy as the inspector, and I've got Jimmy as the CO 100 person, and then we got a HVA person, Sam, and we've got all these different people out there. And then I'm gathering the information from them, and I'm coming back to Jay and saying, here's what they said. Okay, well, I don't understand that. I don't agree with it. So go back to this. And now all of a sudden I've added a layer of communication that is 100% unnecessary. Doesn't mean you shouldn't be involved in it. It just changes to, great news, Jay. Lucy's gotten the inspection done. She's got the inspection report, or she's going to be out there this day. Want to introduce you all, so we're there. And then when she goes through the report, she gets done with it. She's going to actually go through it with you. I'm going to be there so I can listen through and everything. And I can obviously give you my thoughts, but they're the expert. Okay. Again, I stress this for two reasons. One, because that's what they're there for. And two, liability. I get it. You make a lot in this. You want to feel like that you're controlling everything, and you still can drive it, which is why it's important to have good inspectors and everyone on your team. But don't be the communication. I'm telling you, I can think of just off the top of my head right now, 3 different situations that had the agent just done a better job of facilitating the communication between the professionals and the client. The issue that arose would never have arisen. It still keeps you as the expert. And by the way, it makes your job so much easier. And I don't mean that in a don't worry about me kind of thing. You still have the obligation of the customer service and communicating with them all, but I'm telling you, it's so much easier. Okay. All right. Jumping back on. Fun stuff coming in for landing. Mediation clause. Should we get into an argument, we agree to mediate through the NAR, or we'll use SCR at a local level, that we will, mediate any differences that we have. Typically that's not going to happen between a buyer and a buyer's agent unless they, fire them within the transaction. This also is brought up when they go under contract. Should you have any information or need any information regarding the sex offenders locally, the criminal information, anything like that, that's not information I can relay to you. You do need to go to the public websites for doing so. This is an entire binding agreement, which means if you sign it, that you are obligated to everything that's in the agreement during the terms of the agreement. Any contingencies in here? The only thing I really see in here is some people will put an easy out clause. In the event either party would like to terminate this agreement, they may do so at any time with written notice. I know a lot of people do that. For instance, I gave the example earlier of buyer's agency agreements only ending at the end of June and the end of December. If it's April 30th, you don't want a buyer's agency agreement ending in 2 months, but they may not want to go all the way to December 31st. An easy out helps all of them. Paragraph 18 basically says you can use fax machines and other electronic means for signatures. This does not mean that emails are considered binding, but they can be used as it relates to notifications or notices. Paragraph 19 does say we do have to disclose that properties that we go into may have both audio and video surveillance, and that we need to be aware of that surveillance and basically make sure that when we're in any properties, if you have questions, definitely ask. But if you want to talk about the properties in any detail, let's wait till we get back to the car, or back to my office, or back to Starbucks, wherever you're meeting. Don't do it on the front porch. That's actually the worst place to do it. And then this is a legally binding agreement. Should you have any further questions about the contents of this and not understood, then you should basically talk to an attorney. And that is buyer agency. Questions?
I have a question. What is the CO 100 you were talking about?
So the CO 100 is basically the wood infestation report. It's basically our version of the termite inspection. It's also wood moisture and that sort of thing.
Okay.
So in the contract, it's a separate contingency from the inspection. What else? Any other questions? General questions, fire away. You can ask about anything.
I have a question that may be more specific to like a DocuSign technical question, but is there a choice where, like, if I'm providing this, I'm just trying to think of an example. The consent for dual agency agreement question, where I can't remember exactly how it's worded, but are you okay? Do you give me permission? Do you like highlight it and say choose whichever you like, or like, because I think that the way that I've seen it before is you put a checkbox in there. It's almost like you're choosing for them and saying, if you agree with what I've already chosen, check it.
Right.
I don't know. Is there anything that you could speak to about that?
Yeah, so good question. And in any of those, that's why it's important too. And I see this very often. And this, again, for me, as a checks and balances to make sure this doesn't happen, you do have to choose which one they're going to sign, because you have to put it there, right? Which is why the first time they read it should not be when you send it to them for signatures, unless the plan is for you to walk through it with them. Right. And that way, when you get to it, you say, okay, so here we are. So we'll use your example, Lauren, on the agency. Say, so this is where you would consent to the dual agency situation. Now, again, I explained to you what these are. You initial to that you don't accept it or that you will. It is my recommendation that you do, because we are the second largest firm locally. So there is a high chance that there may be designated agency. However, if that is not something that you want to do, I don't want you to feel that I force you to do it. It's just my initial recommendation. We can talk through it.
So I can have like a checkbox there for them to initial, and if they choose not to, they can just skip over that and not provide their initial in DocuSign.
Correct, but it has to, if it's not disclosed on there, you just open, you want to make sure if they don't initial either one, they will have to initial one of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Makes sense. Thanks.
All right, what else?
I have a question, Joseph.
Yes, sir.
Just as far as like the flow of the relationship with the buyer, so you meet somebody and they're interested, but you don't want to just ask them to sign maybe an agency agreement right before you, at the very beginning. Maybe you want to, it just feels awkward or something. Is that okay? Or because I've heard some people say, well, I'll go show them one house first, stuff like this. But what do you suggest about that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'd be naive to think that everyone gets a buyer's agency agreement signed before they go show property. That doesn't make it right, though, right? So you have a couple different risks when you do that. One, you go show a property to a buyer, to a home, So I'll talk to you about the reasoning behind it, and then we'll go back to the flow of the relationship because they're two separate things, right? So if you go and you show a property to a buyer and you don't have an agency agreement with them, you're technically showing it to them as a customer under transaction brokerage. And if the listing agent is not offering cooperation or compensation to the listing broker, or excuse me, the transaction broker for a buyer's agent, then you run the risk of them not being obligated to pay you should they write an offer on that. Now, obviously, you more than likely would have them sign that before you submit the offer. However, we have seen a couple of times where listing agents have asked for proof of representation prior to them showing the house. So you may run into that. Now, back to your question. You go through a proper buyer consultation, it should be a natural flow to have them sign it at the end, which is why it would be a good thing to integrate your buyer brokerage agreement with your buyer consultation. Now, if you don't do that, and you do want to have it as your practice, is, you know, but they're still saying, hey, I want to be comfortable with you before, you know, we sign anything. I mean, at the end of the day, you get to make your decision on that. I guess the question is, you would never do that with a listing. And the sellers are actually writing you a check, right? Now the buyers are, you know, they're writing the check to cover your commission, which brings me back to another point, which I'll come back to. But it's, you know, they're not agreeing ahead of time to pay you a certain amount. They're going to, you know, a lot of times they're just agreeing that you'll get paid whatever the transaction is. So I think a lot of times the fear that we have is really self-induced. You'd be surprised. I mean, there are a lot of the teams, a lot of the larger teams have a very strict no-show policy if they don't have a buyer agency agreement with them. I had my first team leader always told me, if you're afraid to ask one buyer to sign an agency agreement because they'll say no, then you don't have enough buyers. Which is always an annoying piece of feedback, especially when you're new. That does bring up one of the things that NAR has slid in. Well, they haven't slid in. One thing we have done a bad job of sharing is the change to NAR rules is you are not allowed to represent yourself where you work for free under the assumption that what you mean is the seller pays your commission. NAR has deemed that improper because at the end of the day, the buyer is paying the commission because they're paying for the house, which is what creates the proceeds for the commission. So NAR is very much cracking down, and that's probably actually going to be the broker minute for this week, is not advertising yourself as working for free where the seller pays my fee. And they are starting to require, this doesn't really bother me, but it will bother some, is that they are requiring the MLSs to open the feed through IDX that does display what the listing agent is offering to pay the buyer's agent. So that will be public record to your buyers. So they will know how much that is. Again, you know, I told Lynn that, and she was like, well, my buyers always know what I get paid. I don't understand that. A lot of people aren't comfortable with this. They think that it's going to be, you know, affect their buyers wanting to use them. And quite frankly, I just mean, to me, and this is painting with a broad brush, admittedly, to me, this just means they're not explaining properly to their clients how the situation works. So glad I said that, because that's my reminder to do my broker minute when we get off the phone. All about time blocking, folks. All right. Anything else? All right. Well, thank you guys for being here. Of course, if you have any questions, shoot me an email, give me a call. Good luck. If you have any questions about this, I'm here to help.
Thank you. When were you doing the list side?
Thanks, Joseph.
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday's the list side?
Yes.
Thank you.
All right.
Great day.
Bye, guys.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
See you, Steve.